today, both in person and online for our annual update. We haven't actually been able to meet in person at all for several years, so it's great to be finally back and to also include people from around the country as well who are joining online. When we started the Williams Institute over 2 decades ago, it was for the explicit purpose of countering myths and stereotypes about LGBTQ people that were running rampant and driving policy. I think it's unfortunate and fitting that 2 decades later, we are having a conference today on that very topic, because all of this last several years events, the work of the Institute and focusing on the misinformation that is out there about LGBTQ people is more important now than it's ever been. So we are glad you can join us for today's discussion. We're going to get started in just a second. For the folks who are online, just a reminder that we are glad that you can join us. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to respond to your questions during the programs, but save them and feel free to email to them to us or the speakers later on. And with that, we're going to get our first panel started, which will be led by Bianca Wilson, who is our Rabbi Zaki Senior Scholar of Law and Policy at UCLA School of Law.
Good morning, and thank you, Brad, and welcome everyone to our first panel for our annual update. I'm really pleased to be moderating this panel, actually organized by Elon here. I think this is will serve as an important foundation for the day and its discussion of misinformation. So the title of today's talk is The Research Challenge, Responding to LGBTQ-related Misinformation in Science. And I am joined here by our panelists, Dr. Judith Glassgold, a behavioral health advocacy and education consultant and policy consultant, Dr. Jevin West, an associate professor at the University of Washington, and our own Dr. Ilan Meyer, who's a distinguished senior scholar of public policy here at the Williams Institute. And so let me tell you a little bit about how we've organized the panel so you have a sense of what to expect. We've asked each of our panelists to speak briefly about their experiences as scientists and scholars with misinformation within the sciences and in relationship to the sciences. And then I have a couple of questions, which I might ask one or two to the panelists, depending on how we're doing with time, to help draw out some of the themes of their work on this topic. And then we hope to leave a significant amount of time, at least 10 to 15 minutes for questions and comments from the audience that is here in person. And we really look forward to this conversation. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Elon.
Thank you, Bianca. And thank you, Jevin and Judith, for responding to my email, first of all. Easy. And for coming here. I'm looking forward to this conversation. We have 3 panels today, but I would say that probably this one is somewhat more complex, and I will explain why I think that, because science is those issues of misinformation in science are more complicated, I think, within science, for the reasons that we will discuss. And many of them Jevin have written about. And so I'm going to provide a little bit of an introduction and some background, which is kind of interesting, the way, Bianca, you introduced it as personal. So this is like personal and scientific, and we used to say personal is political, that too. I think my short history of this topic starts in 2010, which was the Proposition 8 trial in California, where, in my estimation, conservatives fighting against LGBT rights came up empty-handed when they needed to produce scientific evidence in court. Witnesses for the defendant interveners were, I think, not just by my account, embarrassing, had no scientific facts to present to the court. On the other hand, experts on the other side, on the anti-Proposition 8 side, presented very compelling evidence, very comprehensive evidence, and convinced the judge in that case to strike down Proposition 8. But it seems like conservative advocates have gathered strength since 2010 and have been creating a record of scientific or quasi-scientific papers since then. By 2015, when Obergefell was heard by the US Supreme Court, sociologist Mark Rudneros published a paper purporting to show that children of LGBT parents, I have put my screen, were worse off than children of straight parents. And this was an important argument in the discussions around same-sex marriage at the time. The paper's conclusion were almost universally reviewed by scientists, including the American Sociological Associations and faculty at Rudneros's home sociology department at UT Austin. But the review didn't stop it from being offered in court briefs. In 2016, that was the kind of first big paper that appeared in a scientific journal under very suspicious circumstances, I would add. And that was 2015. In 2016, by the way, that paper appeared in scientific journals just before the court case. So it was very clearly coordinated to be presented as evidence, and in fact was presented in a brief to the court. In 2016, we were all here at least mailed a self-published paper by McHugh and Meyer titled Sexuality and Gender, Findings from the Biological, Psychological, and Social Sciences. As I said, it was self-published, has been since used in court cases and presented in legislative bodies providing evidence to oppose gender affirmative treatment of transgender people. Personally, I've had several encounters with conservative scientists attacking minority stress. Minority stress is a framework that I developed and many people use that says that social stigma and prejudice against LGBT people is related to poor health and health disparities between LGBT and straight cisgender populations. Obviously, that framework goes against conservative ideology about LGBT people in their rights and their rights. For example, Salins, Ragnaros, and others submitted a brief to the Supreme Court, most recently in the case of 303 Creative, outlining why the vast research on minority stress is wrong. They deny that there is pervasive prejudice and discrimination against LGBT people, and if they were, they say it has no adverse health effects on adverse health effects. One of those writers, Donald Salins, a retired sociology professor from Catholic University, has vigorously attacked a paper by John Glosnick and others and me that showed an association between conversion therapy and suicide behavior in LGBT people. Salins has written not only a letter to the American Journal of Public Health, where our paper was first published, but also using the generations data, which we collected and shared with the public. He published two separate papers purporting to correct our results, ultimately showing falsely that conversion therapy is not only not leading to suicidality, but actually it prevents it. Conservative advocates seem to follow a strategy of publishing letters in main scientific journals, publishing papers wherever they can, or sometimes self-published, and then referring to these papers in letters to the editor, and later being able to cite their letter to the editor as evidence, because the letter to the editor has referred to findings that were not actually published or peer-reviewed. Thus, they falsely cite work in various amicus briefs as work that has been subjected to peer review. Using these tactics, conservative writers are working to sow doubt about knowledge that has been accumulated for decades, actually, of research on the role of prejudice and stigma on health of LGBT people, the effect of conversion therapy, and affirmative treatment for transgender individuals. And this is the important part. They don't need to do much more than sow doubt for the purpose of convincing courts and legislators against falsely that evidence is unclear, that both sides have good evidence, and especially that there is scientific debate on the topic. Courts and legislators are not great at distinguishing among scientific outlets and are not about to judge good versus bad science. The adversarial legal system allows full airing of both sides. Conservative advocates also say that in mainstream research on LGBT issues, quote from Regnerus, politics have crowded out sound scientific methodology. This statement is somewhat ironic because Regnerus' own testimony was rejected by a federal judge who found that he conducted, quote, result-oriented research in order to, quote, oblige a politically driven funder. This was the case in Michigan at the bar recited. By using scientific discourse, publishing in various forums, for example, Solin's work has been published on YouTube, and John and I received questions from different parts of the world questioning our paper because they saw Solin's report more before they even saw ours. And making strong policy recommendations that are not directly connected to any specific findings, if they even have findings. Advocates on the right advance anti-LGBT policy agenda by using scientific discourse, which favors debate, they succeed. So that's what I was referring to, that it's more complicated in scientific discourse. It is important to note that of the three panels today, scientific discourse is probably the most complicated because by its very nature, it invites debate. For example, every scientific paper discusses its methodological limitations, which become fodder for attacks by anti-LGBT advocates. So they say, you even said it yourself in your paper that this is not 100% sure. Importantly, academics invite debate, which I support personally, but also this provides cover for misinformation. For example, after the McEwen-Meyer paper on transgender that is being used so much by against transgender people, and it was met by criticism at the time, Johns Hopkins University, which published the paper, as I say, it was self-published, but it was part of Johns Hopkins. They were in the faculty then. And Johns Hopkins stated, as one of the world's leading research institutions, we value scientific integrity and academic freedom. Members of our faculty are free to share their views and opinions. So again, this is just demonstrating how much they are successful within the scientific discourse to find this kind of quote unquote debates, as they have done with climate change, COVID, and other areas. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Eli. Thank you. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bless.
So I'm going to take a somewhat different tack. I'm a clinical psychologist by training and was a psychotherapist for decades. So my take on this is really my goals, and I think most people's goals, which is to provide the best therapy to LGBTQ people and to avoid much of the damage that was done to LGBTQ folks way back in the mid of the 20th century by efforts that stereotyped and pathologized LGBTQ people. We have to remember that the practice of psychiatry and psychology originally was quite flawed. And it's only by the emerging empirical science led by Evelyn Hooker, who was affiliated with UCLA back in 1957, the first paper, that empiricism, with its ability to be more objective and to have rigorous methodology, that gay people, queer people were allowed to emerge and deal with some of the stereotypes that we were all mentally ill. This then led to immense progress in civil rights, allowing child custody arrangements, equality in employment. So much of the civil rights, in one perspective, rests on the improvements and the sort of foundation of good science that refuted so much of the stereotypes. So much of my work for the last 40 years, starting in graduate school, has been trying to educate and implement better theories and practices in psychotherapy that rests on the kind of science that people like Alon does, particularly the theory of minority stress and some other people here who have done excellent work. My engagement with misinformation or attempts to misinform, perhaps or better, started in 2003 when a congressman, who turned out to be my congressman in New Jersey, attempted to get the NIH to defund 3 particular studies, one of which was a study by Karina Walters, a graduate of UCLA again, who does work on two-spirit psychology and issues. And he said that was violating, the government should not provide funding for these kind of awful topics. At the same time, this was in 2003, Spitzer, who had been seen as an ally of the LGBTQ movement, published an article against advice, of course, by many people, that sexual orientation could be changed. This then became fodder for political disputes and the culture wars of that era. And as a result, the American Psychological Association formed a task force, which I chaired, to try to resolve these issues. And that's one method of addressing some of the problems that emerge in science, is by a panel of experts that review the evidence, like a systematic review that deals with this. So we did a 2009 report on, can sexual orientation be changed by psychotherapy? It cannot. And some people report harms. And it was a good study. It was very, I think, fair and balanced, if I can, not because of my work, some other people did the methodological analysis. It was a good, it's passed the test of time. And our opponents who dispute some of the research like it because they can quote sentences out of context, because we have so many sentences. And we have a lot of very interesting sort of ways to balance things. This started, though, a whole new eruption of work in New Jersey in a case, Jonas, Ferguson v. Jonas. A judge used that report to say that doing conversion therapy was a form of consumer fraud because sexual orientation could not be changed. And Ted Lieu, who is congressman for many of you and who was in the state legislature in 2011, initiated a law to ban conversion therapy in California for sexual orientation that passed. And now there are 20 such laws, nationwide, and some other bans. So though we did not expect it as a group of scientists and clinicians, our work became part of policy. And now those policies are challenged by people who are also publishing those articles, and it becomes another sort of problematic culture wars. And the latest ones are the sort of, whether it's trying to overturn the bans on conversion therapy, or more troubling, banning gender affirming care. So what emerged with conversion therapy in these bans was we could not ban these types of legislation for adults because adults have free choice and are informed enough to make even dangerous choices for themselves. But minors need protection. So the rationale was we would ban therapy for minors. But to do so, we have to prove harms. So now we did find some evidence of harms, and Bloch's study, as well as others, show increased suicide risk for those who've experienced conversion therapy. So this has now become the language of harms. Gender affirming medical care causes harms. And that this is and the statements about gender affirming medical care are erroneous. So SAMHSA, the U.S. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Association, borrowing a page from our 2009 report, collaborated with APA in 2015 to publish a report on conversion therapy, both for sexual orientation and gender identity in minors. And just last month, at the very end of the month, it published a new report on that same topic that really summarized the research on those issues. And I think is a good antidote in some ways to some of the misinformation that Florida has used in banning or challenging gender affirming care, where they selectively choose literature to show that gender affirming care is harmful or is not beneficial. Rather, in the SAMHSA report, which is that gender affirming care can create real benefits, but treatment has to be tremendously individualized. And that, again, gender affirming care helps individuals. So, over my career, I started as a clinician working on psychotherapy issues. And now I spend most of my time, and I think a lot of us do, as a response, since this panel is on responses to misinformation, spending our time writing depositions, testifying, advising, sort of political attacks that I think try to take us back 50 years before homosexuality was removed from the DSM and pathologize and delegitimize LGBTQ individuals. And I think science has always been our ally. So these threats to the science that Alana is pointing out, I think, are tremendously disturbing and dangerous because, as he said, not all judges and lawyers are well enough informed or policymakers to understand the scientific literature. And they say, well, just do an RCT or, sort of these kind of sort of vague remarks or just taking snippets of information. So I think the next task for us all is to continue to do science, but to, debate some of these issues and find our way.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to move, Jevin, would you be moving this a little closer?
A little closer. Is that better right there?
Okay, yeah.
Is that better? All right. Well, first of all, thanks for taking the time to come listen to us talk about this and enjoying that conversation. And thanks for putting this together. So I spend most of my waking hours in the darker corners of the internet. So I co-founded, which is kind of depressing, which is good to have sunlight here to walk out of here. So I co-founded a center at the University of Washington with my colleagues that's devoted to studying issues of misinformation and disinformation with a particular interest, at least for me in my research career, on misinformation in science and about science. So we have all sorts of methods that we use to go about doing that. We collect large data sets every second. Actually, we're collecting right now publicly available data to study the ways in which conversations about science, about health issues, about elections, how certain ideas and institutions and organizations get amplified and how others get squashed. And so in that time, over the years studying this issue, it's taught me a lot about how sciencing works and how it doesn't work. And actually in my side time, I also publish and think a lot about the philosophy of science in a new area called the science of science, which is a lot of sciences. But actually what's funny is the original Science of Science article was published in the journal Science. So that was the joke, the internal joke for our field that was evolving. But here's my sort of quick view of science, and I hope it'll inform our conversation going forward and builds off of what's already been kind of said. Science is an institution that's still well trusted in society. There's been there's constant surveys that are going out. Pew Research has been doing these for years. And the institution of science, even though there's been some drop over the last couple of years with the pandemic and the political charge that we see in these collective conversations online, still remains relatively high. Now, of course, one of the first things you should do is break it down by certain variables. Okay, where are these individuals from? What's their political affiliation? What's their education, age, et cetera? Even when you break down by all those things, it's still one of the most trusted institutions. So it matters when developing policy. It matters when we have conversations with the public and people that are going to go and elect individuals that are pushing different kinds of policies. So that's one of the things, one of the reasons it matters is because science is respected for the most part in society, despite some of these drops in the last couple of years. The problem is we haven't done a good job educating the public about how science works. A lot of how science is taught is about facts. You're memorizing, this species, or you're memorizing this sort of physics law. We don't teach the public how science works as an institution. We don't talk about how it's embedded in a social institution run by humans, not by, as I was joking out here, that if science was run by bees or ants, we might not have some of the issues that we have. But but science is run by humans and they respond to incentives. They make mistakes. There can be errors in measurement. There can be errors in the way we interpret things. There can be misuse of models, et cetera, et cetera. I can go on and on. And a lot of people will say, well, and there's also fraud in science, and that it is, but the research around the amount of fraud in science is actually quite low. And I can speak to some of those examples. There's lots of reasons why it's low. A lot of people don't self-report their own fraud, but it also, that's one of the big reasons. But still, even despite that, I think it is relatively small. That's not what pushes a lot of the misinformation, at least that we've seen around science. A lot of times it's through other kinds of mechanisms. So I'll give you some examples to be very specific. So we have a paper in review right now that looks at the mask debate that was going on during the pandemic. And as you'd expect, in science, if you look at the scientific literature and you look at how the conversations break out, they break out by methodology, by discipline, et cetera. Then when we jump over into our large social media data sets, it breaks up by stance. Not so surprising, right? We have these large networks and you see it broken up by discipline, you see it broken up by stance in social media. So you have the pro-mask and the anti-mask. And when you dive into those communities, you find that both are using science. Not only are they both using science to support their arguments, many times they're using the exact same literature. How can that be? They're using the same literature for very different arguments. And one of the most cited mask papers on both sides, both pro and anti, was a paper written by McIntyre. And McIntyre is one of the kind of world experts on this. And one paper that McIntyre published made the claim that cloth masks in one particular setting, in this one hospital, in this very, very, very narrow sort of environment situation, showed that they didn't work all that well. Well, this was then picked up and it exploded on social media. It was used on a lot of in the conversations that were, pushing anti-mask, saying it doesn't work. It even reached all the way up to Fox News and Tucker Carlson. And the author themselves had to make a statement on the website. I think might have been the New England Journal of Medicine, where they are allowed, this doesn't happen very much with publishers, and this is something we'll talk about in terms of improving some of the ways misinformation spreads. But the author said, just so you know, this has many issues with this. I am the author, and I very much support the use of masks for reducing the spread of this infectious disease, et cetera. And so these sorts of things happen. And by the way, we've seen this exact same thing happen, this miscitation and out of context citation happening with what's happening in Florida, like Judith mentioned, and this was reported by Greenspan at Vice News, where many of the authors, there were like only a handful of papers that were cited, and almost all of them, if not all of them, didn't even know they were being cited. And many of them were like, you're actually citing me out of context here. One of them said, well, and did quote it directly from the paper, said, well, there's not a lot of papers that have looked at the psychological and developmental issues associated with this particular policy that was being pushed. And this was an older paper, so this was a half a decade ago, and there's been a ton of research since. And so the author's like, that's so miscited, even though this was the author that was being cited for this. So this is an example of the kinds of ways in which even good science, either cited out of context, cherry-picked, or misinterpreted, can lead to that. A lot of people think bad science or misinformation in science and disinformation, which is another issue because there's an intentional element that's hard to measure, but that a lot of that's being driven by just bad science. And there is bad science published in predatory journals, and it's going to continue with ChatGPT and all the ways in which you can now, I call them bullshitters at scale. You can create all that you want science with these new technologies, but even the good science, high reputation, top tier kinds of journals can be taken out of context, can be miscited, and sometimes by honest mistake, but also, of course, with political agendas. And just so you know, and another example in which this passes, and then I'll summarize so we can get to the general conversation, is that there's been a bunch of work looking at even retractions, for example. Science is always making changes, and that's the beauty of this institution, is that it can look at new data and then make a change, or even authors themselves can go, whoops, I made a mistake. And I wish we would remove that bad social badge that comes along with saying, I made a mistake and retracting my paper. But one of the studies this is multiple studies have shown that retracted papers continue to be cited in their original form even after. So that's a problem with the publication system not coming in and saying, you keep citing this. This is not the right way to cite. We need big, huge red X's, on the thing that don't cite this. But that's not what happens. Publishers are so slow in responding to these types of things. So these are the kinds of things we look at. And if we have time, I'll talk about some of these other issues: selection bias, correlation causation issues that happen all the time. But I'll stop there by just summarizing by saying science is well trusted. It does matter. We just need to do a better job of communicating that and then identifying these ways that aren't just fraud and the things that you think were just bad science, but the ways in which most often they're taken out of context.
Yes. Thank you, Jim. We will come back to that.
Okay, awesome.
So what we'll do now, I have a couple of questions, and I think this will really help to bring out some more of the themes from each of your comments, and then we'll open it up for everyone. I mean, something that struck me is each of you in different ways really highlight the inherent vulnerability of science to misuse. And what's so difficult about that vulnerability is it's embedded in the strength of science, which is a respect for uncertainty. And, given that and really bringing it back to the kind of work that folks like at the Williams Institute do, and those who are engaged in sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression related equity research, or research aimed at informing equity efforts. Help us think through, what is that line? What is that line here between misinformation and science and simply different results that might complicate an equity or justice effort? I'm looking at you, but you don't have to start, Elon. Anyone can start.
Well,
Yeah.
as you were talking, I was thinking about a lot of things, but one thing I was thinking about the discontinuity between scientific discourse and what might be called the culture wars now. So we were recently alerted. I was recently alerted, and I'm looking at Rachel, our communications director, because I had this conversation with her. We were alerted to how findings that we published were misused. And there were hundreds, according to this person, of Twitter notices using this misinformation. And I was alarmed because we try to respond to misinformation, but it's also difficult. How do you respond? Which we can maybe talk about also, like what can we do actually? And I was saying to Rachel, I don't know if you noticed, but this is my favorite new quote of Rachel. And she told me, you know what, there's no room for, debate that is nuanced on Twitter. And that is the problem where we're faced, because science is nuanced.
It is nuanced, exactly.
And for me to have answered, Rachel said, can you answer it in like a tweet? And I mean, but it wasn't that I could say this is completely wrong, but it wasn't right. And the reason was nuance. And so that's, I think, is an important distinction between, and I would say, not just science, I would just add one more thing. The legal system and legislator by extension that uses the adversary process so that each side advances their own side. That's completely different than scientific system. And when we, and certainly, like I would say, when I go on a testimony, we're pushed both by ourselves and by the advocates to make statements that are not consistent with the spirit of science, in that sense that we want to be clear, and we should be clear. It's again, what I'm saying here now is nuance. Those of you who are going to quote it, it is not something that we can say, oh, this is all wrong, because there's some elements there that we need to explain. And there's no room for that anymore. I feel.
No, that's a great point. And I think one of the challenges is that I see one of the differences that scientists are interested in answering questions, and they have a good faith desire to discover something and to answer a question. That's their ends. Science is not a means to an end. But I think sometimes, I worked in Congress, I worked doing research for Congress at the Congressional Research Service. Policymakers always have another end in mind. And so their use of science is instrumental to justify something. And sometimes, because their values are so, and their perspectives are so clearly defined in advance of getting information, they'll interpret the same piece of information differently. I once estimated for members of the Diabetes Caucus in Congress how much the federal government spends on diabetes care. The Democrats said, we don't spend enough. The Republicans said, we spend too much. And I thought, okay, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. It's sort of like the same number means two different things. And I think we lose nuance because we lose a lot in that when people approach things with different perspectives. The evidence is there. How we approach it in science it's very important to approach it with an open mind.
Jevin, I don't know if this is a place where you might want to even talk about the distinction between you mentioned like misinformation and disinformation or.
Yes. Okay. Well, I'll do that. And then I'll build on this because I think there's some really good points here. So, the real difference, at least the way we look at it, is just with intention. The disinformation element has that intentional component, which is really hard to measure, which is why it's very hard to, when people say, oh, it's disinformation. The way we look at it, that's pretty hard to do. You would have to know something about intention, but it's also complicated. Disinformation is also complicated from the few examples that we have studied well in the literature, not just by our group, but other groups, is that it's multifaceted, multi-stakeholder. It has elements of truth. It has elements, of course, of falsehoods. The one thing that really helps us identify disinformation campaigns typically is the strategic element. So if there's timings that come out by multiple institutions, multiple groups, the strategic element is something we're looking for because the intention part is harder to measure. So that's that element. But I do want to just build on what was just said because I thought it was really valuable and sort of resonates the way that I think about it too. When I was young and I looked at science, I sort of viewed it as this pure system, this purely imaginative. You're sort of go in the basement of some library or museum and you sort of just think and you collect data. I saw it sort of as this epistemically pure activity. It's not. We are humans. It's epistemically solid. And when we have that element, so we have this human side, it's epistemically solid. And then you have this side where science is tough, especially when it involves humans and social systems, especially. This is very difficult. So it requires this nuance, yet we live in an age that wants answers now. And we saw this, of course, in the pandemic, saw a couple of, interesting things other than the pandemic, of course, but at least from my perspective as a researcher who does sort of computational social science, it was the first time we sort of, the science was thrown out into the public. There's other times, but certainly was. And the public seeing it in real time, but also wanting answers in the kinds of speeds that we expect on social media mucked things up a lot when it comes to all sorts of issues. And of course, we're seeing it with these issues as well. So I think that nuance element is so very important. And I think we have to build that norm, not only just to remind ourselves, even in the science world, remind the policymakers and remind the public.
Right. And if I can just say one more thing I was thinking about that brief to the Supreme Court that Whitmer's and collaborators wrote. It was attacking minority threats research, which was interesting to me. And the reason it was interesting, some of it was kind of disinformational because you could tell that some of them they quoted an article where they said that LGBT people don't experience prejudice and they had percentages. And I was not familiar with the article, so I was kind of surprised. And I looked at it, it doesn't mention LGBT. It's a general population study, but there wasn't even divided data. So that was the total lie, right? But a lot of their critiques of minority race was critiques that are not even critiques of science. So one of the things that I kind of was thinking, like, how do you actually explain that? They said, well, minority stress researchers use a multitude of measures. That is a strength. But
That's exactly
right.
Yes, exactly.
That's a strength because we don't want to be confined to one measure because the measure itself could be biased, right? So we try to do the multi-measure, multi-method is a concept that you learn in methods.
Research
class.
methods, yeah,
Right?
yeah,
So
exactly.
I felt they must know that. But it sounds like a really good critique. We don't know what they're doing. They're using all these measures. And for a judge, and that's what I was saying, judges, they're not going to assess it correctly. And so that's just one example of how even good science can be misinterpreted.
Well, and I'll just add just one other thing in addition to that. So that's one thing we can observe a lot of these conversations around science issues and this issue in particular too. I have two students in our center that are working exactly on the things that we're talking about. But the other thing that I'm seeing in terms of sort of the weaponization of science is throwing things out like terms that, we didn't hear before, but we're hearing more. Oh, it's not an RCT. It's not a randomized controlled trial. So you can't trust it when in fact, some of these can't be designed. There's things that you just can't do, not even just putting aside the expense. And so then judges will hear that. They'll say, oh, well, it's not an RCT. So
just to clarify, RCT means that you divide people randomly into treatment and non-treatment or alternative treatment. You can't do that with most of the things that we're talking about. You don't randomly assign transgender people to treatment or not treatment, and you don't randomly assign people to conversion therapy because we know it's unethical. So when they say RCT, it's true that we don't have RCT, but there's a reason why we don't have RCT, and that's the nuanced part.
Exactly.
I'll ask one more question and then open it up and whoever wants to respond can respond or everyone briefly. So we have time for folks. So this is related to the responses. Like we're already kind of talking about where do we go from here and what are also the challenges involved in being responsive to this issue. And I think up until now, we've been talking about the use of science in the context of, or among those who are interested in anti-LGBT studies or anti-health science. But there's still complications in terms of how we engage with those that are working on justice issues and see themselves as pro-LGBT and kind of this challenge between the courts and academia. And that's relevant not just in the anti-LGBT space, but in the LGBT space. So I was wondering if you all could speak to kind of just what is the role of the scientist involved in social justice for LGBT people who must balance these competing frameworks of truth and evidence between the courts and the academy. And you have like a minute each.
I feel like I've been in that position and then I'm not listened to. So part of it is, when you say to someone, when I advised a legislator, I said, if you do this, there'll be a backlash and your opponents will introduce the same bill, but for affirming care. I mean, I said that in 2012 and it came true. But it's sort of like you say, there's not enough evidence, or I can't say this. It's very hard. And I think a lot of time it's this issue of intention and the instrument. I use the word instrumentality, that sort of science is a hammer and we're going to bang this nail using the authority of science. And I think that's a problem for both sides. But I think the way we do the social justice work is we ask better questions about social justice. I mean, science is predominantly white, upper middle class, people who have assets. We're not getting the right data. So like your work on the health disparities among ethnic minoritized people is important. I mean, I think that's the way to do it, is to do more focused research rather than try to shape our existent body of knowledge to answer questions you can't answer. But that's sort of on the top of my head.
Yeah, I think that's true. That's where we have and that's where there's room for our quote unquote biases, is in choosing the topics that we want to study. We study things because we think they're important and that we want to influence policies. but I think it is difficult when advocates use the same research that is not, there's nothing that's going to be foolproof. And to me, I cringe on the other side as well when people say things that I feel are not nuanced. That's the problem. It's going back to, can we say nuanced things? Can we say we know this much, but not? And you're right. I think COVID was a really great example of people said, well, why didn't you tell us this before? Well, it just happened like 2 weeks ago. We don't know everything yet. And that is the nuance that the public was not able to accept, basically. And I think we faced that a lot with social justice and LGBT rights.
And with healthcare, where healthcare is always nuanced and individualized. It's not
Right.
one size fit all most of the time. You get the last word.
Right. Well, I'm really thinking about this question around the social justice element. And I just returned from a conference that was around climate change, greenwashing, and some of these other elements that are arising within corporate conversations and also within the public as well. And this question was almost the same in that group. And it wasn't my response. I thought it was a good response that when you talk about, climate change, it really is an issue of racial equity too, and then the health disparities that exist because of exactly that. And I think as you frame it, and this is exactly what Judith was saying, I think it really then allows us, in science, we look for things to collect and observe. And if we can move it into that realm, then I think it really strengthens our ability to engage the public around these conversations. And we have a study right now working with a student at Stanford, Mallory Harris, where we're looking at the role of expertise online. So the role that a doctor next to your name or a PhD next to your name, what role does that play in convincing individuals and also in just the number of likes and retweets and all these other things that they get? Turns out, this is preliminary, since this is a research project, that this really does play a role. But the problem is that people that, let's say, have a PhD in English are giving advice on whether vaccines are safe or not. And I think distinguishing between even those things, because reputation does matter. And I'll say this, I used to sort of believe in what's called Mertonian, these Mertonian ideals. This is this idea that in science, we should be able to look at ideas vacant from where those ideas came from, sort of like disconnected from the individuals. And that sounds great, but in practice, and in this world that we live in now, where all these conversations happen online and policy does flow from those collective conversations around social justice issues and around health issues, that I think we need to return more to pushing that reputation does matter in this case, because where I've seen a lot of misinformation when it comes to science issues, when everyone comes to the table that doesn't have that training, and I say this almost cringing, that I don't want to say that everyone should be able to speak to these things, but expertise matters in this case. And I think that would help legitimize, but also is problematic all by itself. So it's probably even a bad way to end, because it's kind of a mucky way to end.
I tell a little bit of an anecdote about expertise and judges. So I was in a case in
Quick anecdote.
What?
Quick anecdote.
Yeah, very. I was in a case and it was a bisexual defendant. And I had to explain to the judge 3 times that bisexual is not the same as transgender.
Wow.
Yeah. So
On that note, so thank you all. I know we moved quickly. We're trying to make up a little bit of time, but I think even, so I'm going to open it up. I want to give maybe 1 to 2 questions at the most. And then, questions will kind of keep coming up throughout the days, and we might be able to keep engaging in these conversations. Anyone have any questions? Yes. Let's see one. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this amazing conversation. I'm working in the field of diversity in clinical trials. The biggest issue that I see in our community is we don't have the same consensus within our LGBTQ community when it comes to transition. Like I have to convince one of my friends who's lesbian, so she doesn't agree with the treatment of children. So I had to explain about my own story, that I had gender dysphoria when I was 4 years old. I'm 54 right now. I have the same gender dysphoria now. So when she heard these stories, then she was able to convince herself that she was learning from it. But it's very difficult for us to be advocating for our own, within the LGBT is great for the external world. But how do we address some of these issues and build an allyship within our own community? Even being a part of the LGBT community.
Yeah, I mean, and I think part of the challenge too that we're hearing from the panelists here, and I assume you meant she was a cisgender lesbian, not a trans lesbian woman, that, that we have debates even among scientists about what the data are saying. And that's also a challenge, both among queer scientists and outside of queer science.
I just want to add, we also are biased. I went through struggles in the American Psychological Association. Should we include bisexuals? We are flawed individuals. And I think whether it's race, transgender issues, bisexual issues, and part of that is our responsibility as researchers, academics, clinicians to do better. But we don't always.
Yeah, and I think, a question that we didn't really get to for this panel, but I'm hoping maybe throughout the day, it is connected to this. It's that often in these current debates, as you mentioned, so far progress has benefited from good science, and yet I don't think we should take for granted that our professional and dominant scientific associations have had a role in the oppression of many groups. The assumptions around intellectual and cultural inferiority of Black and Indigenous people was embedded in the work of the American Psychological Association. The assumption around homosexuality and any kind of gender nonconformity was embedded and in their minds also defined by their science. So, that's something for us to, and I know even your work has kind of pointed out issues of the lack of rigor that's allowed in the weight and health domain of research. And what does that mean in a contemporary context when we assume just because there's a dominant amount of research saying one thing that it's inherently right. So bias as humans engaged in this work shows up in a lot of places. That's one more question. Yeah.
So y'all mentioned social media pretty early on. And I know social media is connected with misinformation and everyone looks at social media really bad for the most part, right? But as a transgender woman, I use social media and Reddit and things to really engage with my own community. And we build these really cool, some people call them what is it called? Sounding boards or whatever. But these cool communities where we give each other resources and talk to each other. What are y'all's thoughts, views, opinions on social media as an agent for community building and spreading good information and resources and stuff?
So I'll give you the answer that my students ask me at the end of class when I teach about all the problems of social media. And I do, I'm highly critical. I write about it often. But if someone said, you have an opportunity, Jevin, to take away social media from the world, even you could go back in time and take it away, and I wouldn't do it for the very reasons that you've said. And I really think we just have to figure out how to deal with these. We'll have to think about what ways of designing and integrating this into the way we communicate collectively as humans, but I wouldn't take it away. And I also want to say that in this coming age of, this chatbot era that's coming, this shows you how behind we are in exactly this issue. Some chatbots are ready because they're being criticized for the ways that they're sort of going off the rails on issues like LGBTQ issues. Many of them are now just shutting it off. And I think that's problematic too, because what if someone wants to go and use Bing's new search engine to ask some of these issues, if it's a young person or someone that's thinking about these things, that's just as problematic. So we're going to be having this this constant conversation with the developers of these things and society, but I wouldn't take it away.
Thank you very much to all of you. On
Thank
that note,
you.
we will end. So. See you next time.